Hello there, and welcome. Before we begin our journey back in time to the icy depths of Victorian London's winters, I want to take a moment to greet you, wherever and whenever you may be. Whether it is the middle of a busy day, and you seeking a brief escape, or the quiet of night as you drift off to sleep, I'm glad you've chosen to spend this time with me. In the comments below, I'd love to know where in the world you listening from, and what time of day it is for you right now. And if you enjoy these kinds of calm historical deep dives, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you can come along on future adventures through the past. Now, let's allow ourselves to slip away to a very different time and place. The year is 1862, and the setting is London. But not the London you might know from glossy travel brochures or Hollywood films. No, this is a London deep in the clutches of winter. A season that could be both enchanting and utterly unforgiving in equal measure. Imagine, if you will, that you're standing on a cobblestone street corner as the light fades from a lean January sky. All around you, the city's edges have softened, blurred by a dense, bone-chilling fog that seems to seep into every crevice. Gas lamps flicker weakly in the gloom, their warmth a feeble defense against the penetrating cold. In the distance, the wail of a train whistle echoes mournfully, as if lamenting the bitter season that has settled over the great metropolis like a shroud. Pulling your woolen coat tighter, you set off down the street, your footsteps echoing hollowly off the icy stones ahead of you. Hunched figures scurry past, their faces obscured by scarves and high collars, their breath pluming in the frigid air. It's a forbidding scene, one that hints at the hardships and perils that winter routinely inflicted upon the Victorian city's inhabitants, rich and poor alike. But the season held strange wonders, too. Glittering pleasures amidst the privation. Gingerbread stalls and frost fairs, skating parties on frozen ponds, the hush of new fallen snow muffling the city's clamor. Even in the depths of winter, life went on in London, though it demanded a special kind of resilience from those who called it home. Over the next little while, as you nestle deeper into your pillow, or let your mind wander from your daily cares, we'll explore the many facets of winter in Victorian London. From the depths of the Little Ice Age to the delights of the last great Temp Frost Fair. From the plight of shivering street urchins to the frozen obsessions of the city's elite, we'll trace the season's icy tendrils as they wound through every strata of society. Along the way, we'll meet some of the remarkable characters who left their mark on this snowbound chapter of the city's history. Visionaries, villains, and ordinary folk whose lives were shaped by the great leveling force of the cold. And we'll experience in intimate detail some of the era's legendary winter events, from the Great Fog of 1879 to the paralyzing Great Winter of 1894. But before we fully immerse ourselves in that vanished world of toffee-nosed tobogganists and half-frozen hawkers, of icy spectacles and smoggy specters, let's first set our historical stage. After all, the winters of Victorian London didn't exist in isolation, but were part of a much vaster meteorological drama that had been unfolding for centuries. A drama that would come to be known as the Little Ice Age, the Victorian era, which roughly spanned the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, coincided with the tail end of a centuries-long period of global cooling known as the Little Ice Age. This climatic anomaly, which reached its frosty between 1550 and 1850, brought harsher, snowier winters to much of Europe and North America, along with a host of social and environmental consequences. In London, the effects of this icy epoch were felt most keenly in the winter months, when temperatures routinely plunged well below freezing, and the city found itself at the mercy of the elements. Newspaper archives from the time are riddled with accounts of especially brutal cold snaps, like the winter of 1813 to 1814, when the tongue froze solid for 2 months, and Londoners held a raucous frost fair right on the ice. Or take the January of 1881, when a 3-day blizzard dumped over a foot of snow on the city, burying streets and bringing transportation to a standstill. The drifts grew so high against St. Paul's Cathedral that enterprising urchins charged visitors a fee to slide down them on borrowed tea trays. But even a regular Victorian winter was nothing to sneeze at. In an era before central heating and snowplows, even a moderate freeze could paralyze the city and cause immense hardship, especially for the poor. Cold soot from thousands of hearths mingled with the natural fog from the tempains, creating a noxious winter pea super that stung eyes and turned white shirts gray. The cold seeped through the thin walls of tenements and the broken panes of rookeries, sending thousands of London's most vulnerable residents shivering to early graves. In the winter of 1866 alone, nearly 2,000 Londoners were reported to have frozen to death, many of them homeless children and elderly paupers. But amidst all the misery, winter also held a certain magic for the Victorians. A pristine snowfall could transform even the dingiest alley into a wonderland, muffling the city's usual din with a hush of enchantment. And though the Little Ice Age's increasingly mild winters meant the tongue seldom froze after 1814, Londoners found other outlets for their fascination with all things frozen. At exclusive winter fêtes, society ladies shivered delightedly in indoor ice grotto and sipped chilled claret beside intricately carved ice statues. Enterprising importers began shipping in huge blocks of ice from the fjords of Norway, kicking off a veritable cold rush as the city's elite clamored for exotic ices and chilled delicacies. For a few glittering, frost-rimed months each year, it seemed London was in the grip of contradictory impulses, a desire to escape the deprivations of winter and a wish to revel in its icy enchantments. But, as we'll see, this tension between winter as perils and pleasures ran like a frozen river through many aspects of Victorian life in the city. One of the most iconic and fearsome elements of a Victorian London winter was the infamous London fog. While the city was prone to mist and fog year-round due to its low-lying geography and damp climate, the so-called pea supers that plagued London in the colder months were a different beast entirely. As temperatures dropped, and Londoners huddled closer to their coal fires for warmth, the smoke and soot pouring from hundreds of thousands of chimneys combined with the chilly river mist to create immense smog banks that could envelop the city for days at a time. Imagine a fog so thick and noxious that it rendered streets dark as night at noon, seeped through window frames and under doorways, and left a greasy black residue on clothing and skin. These choking winter fogs were a feature of London life throughout the Victorian period and well into the 20th century, until the Clean Air Act of 1956 finally began to clear the city of skies. In the 1800s, though, they were an inescapable part of the urban ecosystem and could descend with eerie swiftness to disorient and imperil anyone caught out in them. One of the most notorious of these smog events was the Great Fog of 1879, a toxic, vaporous visitation that brought London to its knees for the better part of a week that winter. Overnight, the miasma swallowed the city's landmarks and rendered travel all but impossible, leading to a rash of accidents as pedestrians and horses blundered sightlessly into the murk. Times of London reported omnibuses and carriages veering wildly off course, their drivers unable to see more than a few feet ahead. In one macabre incident, a hapless pedestrian mistook the parapet of the Temp as embankment for the curb and tumbled into the icy river where he drowned in the muck before rescuers could locate him in the fog. As the days dragged on and the smog refused to lift, the city took on a post-apocalyptic paw. Shopkeepers lit lamps at midday in a futile attempt to penetrate the gloom, while volunteer fog boys in white smokes patrolled the streets with torches, guiding the lost to safety. Trains ran hours behind schedule, their engineers inching along the tracks for fear of collisions. Even the vaunted Houses of Parliament were forced to suspend their sessions when the fog seeped into the chambers and sent MPs into fits of coughing. But perhaps the most haunting accounts from that great fog speak to the otherworldly hush that settled over the normally cacophonous city. Witnesses described an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional thud of a pedestrian colliding with a lamp-post or the muffled cries of disoriented children. In that bleak, half-lit world, it was easy to believe the city had been erased from the earth entirely, leaving only a featureless void in its place. As one anonymous poet put it in the Illustrated London News, "The London fog is a weird thing, a smoky, yellow, moldy fiend. It chokes bus horses and makes men replays at ghosts among the trees. Eventually, of course, the great fog of '79 did lift along with the hundreds of other London particulars that shrouded the Victorian city in winter. But they left their spectral mark on the city's psyche and law. Even today, a proper pupa remains one of the defining images of historical London, a phantasmal presence seeping through countless novels, films, and Sherlock Holmes adaptations. In a strange way, the London fog became a perverse point of pride for Victorians, a homegrown hazard that set their city apart as it rose to unprecedented heights of global power and influence. If Paris was the city of light and Venice, the floating city, then London, for better or worse, was the city of fog, an imperial engine forever half concealed in its own hazy exhaust. But the pea-soupers weren't the only way winter put its stamp on Victorian London. The season also brought with it a beloved pastime that seems almost unthinkable to modern sensibilities: the holding of great parties and commercial fairs right on the frozen surface of the River Thames. The so-called Thames Frost Fairs were a tradition dating back to at least the 15th century, when Londoners took advantage of the river's tendency to freeze over in particularly harsh winters. During the Little Ice Age, when the Thames turned to ice more frequently and reliably, the Frost Fairs grew into grand citywide celebrations that could last for weeks on end. For Londoners rich and poor, the frozen river became a glittering playground, a place to see and be seen while partaking in all manner of chilly amusements. At their height in the 17th and 18th centuries, the fairs boasted a dizzying array of diversions, from ox roasts and beer stalls to puppet shows and nine-pin alleys. Enterprising printers even set up portable presses right on the ice, churning out keepsake tickets and poems for revelers to commemorate the occasion. One of the last and greatest of these frost fairs took place in the winter of 1813-14, during the same cold snap that saw Napoleon's army decimated in its retreat from Moscow. For 4 solid weeks, the Thames was transformed into a boisterous winter carnival, complete with a main thoroughfare, dubbed the City Road, that stretched all the way from London Bridge to Blackfriars. Among the many marvels on display at the 1814 fair was a parading elephant led across the river by its keeper, though no one is quite sure what became of the unfortunate pachyderm after the ice began to thaw. There were also donkey rides, sledding tracks, and even a few enterprising pickpockets who took advantage of the festive crowds to ply their trade. But the undisputed highlight of the fair was the drinking. Dozens of temporary fuddling tents and gin palaces sprang up on the ice, serving up steaming grog and chilled spirits to legions of thirsty patrons. It was said you could get so thoroughly soused at one of these frozen pubs that you might pass out on a bench and wake up days later, after the ice had melted, bobbing along on your wild bar stool. Alas, the 1814 Thames Frost Fair would prove to be the river's last hurrah as a winter playground. As the Little Age released its icy grip and London's climate moderated, the tongue froze over less and less frequently. At the same time, the city's breakneck growth and the increased river traffic brought by the Industrial Revolution made the idea of setting up shop on the ice seem increasingly quaint and impractical. By the time the Victorian era was in full swing, the frost fairs had receded into the realm of folklore, a gaudy memory of the time when winter could transform the very heart of the city into a fantastical frozen dreamscape. For the generations of Londoners who came of age without ever setting foot on the river's icy skin, the Frost Fair became a kind of wintry Brigadian, a magical realm that appeared once in a long ago blue moon, only to vanish again into the mists of history. Still, the spirit of the Frost Fair lived on in other wintertime diversions that emerged to take its place. Victorian Londoners may not have been able to carouse on the Thames itself anymore, but they found plenty of other ways to turn the privations of the season into excuses for merriment and spectacle. At the fashionable ice skating rinks that began popping up in the city's parks and pleasure gardens, well-heeled Londoners showed off the latest in winter fashions and flirted over mugs of mulled wine. Christmas pantomimes and frost-themed balls brought a touch of winter whimsy to the city stages and ballrooms, while Denzian street hawkers peddled roasted chestnuts and hot spice cider on seemingly every corner. Even the era's defining Christmas traditions, from the sending of seasonal greeting cards to the popularity of holly and mistletoe decor, owed much to the Victorians' fondness for domesticating winter's wilder edges. In an age of soot and smog, crinolines and chilblains, the nostalgic ideal of a cozy convivial winter became a kind of escapist balm, a way to keep the season's bleakest realities at bay. But for all their tinsel, and was the Victorians could never completely banish the specters of winter past. The old frost fairs may have faded into legend, but their echoes still haunted the city's consciousness, reminding Londoners of a time when the season held both greater perils and stranger enchantments. In a way, the Thames itself served as a kind of icy Rubicon, a boundary between the city's pragmatic present and its more promiscuous past. On one side lay the sober, striving, smoke-belching London of the Victorian age, with its orphanages and ironworks, its railway terminals and tuberculosis wards. But on the other side, glinting fitfully through the fog, was the frozen, feral, half-forgotten city of the Frost Fairs, a place where elephants paraded on the river and the usual social structures dissolved like snowflakes on a warm tongue. For the Victorians, winter was a season suspended between those two Londons, a time of buttoned-up propriety and wildness rule, of crackling hearths and bone-knowing cold, of bustling commerce and deathly stasis. It was a reminder that for all the modern city's achievements, it was still enthralled to forces far older and more elemental than itself. And it was a challenge to the era's vaunted reputation for progress and civilization, a recurring suggestion that beneath the metropolis's grimy cobblestones and gleaming spires lay something much more, ancient and untamed, a frost-bound heart that beat to the rhythm of its own primal seasonal urges. As we've seen, winter in Victorian London was a time of contradictions, a season that could be both enchanting and unforgiving, playful and perilous. But for all the cozy, Yuletide trappings the era is famous for, the cold months were often defined more by deprivation than celebration, especially for the city's poorest and most vulnerable residents. At a time when steady work was hard to come by and social safety nets were virtually non-existent, the onset of winter could be a death sentence for those living on London's margins. As temperatures plummeted and food grew scarce, thousands of paupers, orphans, and elderly folk faced a grim choice between freezing on the streets or seeking shelter in one of the city's notoriously grim workhouses. These Victorian institutions, immortalized in the works of Charles Dickens and other reformist writers, were essentially warehouses for the indigent, offering bare-bones food and lodging in exchange for back-breaking labor. And as winter tightened its icy grip on London, the poorest residents often suffered the most. For the destitute and homeless, the bitter cold posed a daily battle for survival. Threadbare clothing and malnourished bodies offered scant protection against the bone-chilling temperatures. Many were forced to seek refuge in workhouses, the grim Victorian institutions that provided meager food and shelter in exchange for grueling labor. Imagine being one of London's mudlarks, the desperate children and adults who scavenged the muddy banks of the rivers at low tide, scouring for bits of coal, rope, or anything of value to sell. They faced even harsher conditions in the depths of winter. Numb fingers groped through the frigid muck as icy winds whipped off the water. Frostbite, chill blades, and deadly exposure threatened with every outing. Some enterprising mudlark arcs even used metal plates strapped to their boots to venture further out onto the frozen river in search of treasures lodged in the ice. But perhaps no one epitomized the plight of the Victorian poor in winter more than the match girls. These young women and girls, often barely in their teens, worked long hours in match factories packaging and selling the newly invented Lucifer matches. The work was grim, poorly paid, and fraught with hazards like the dreaded psi jaw, a disfiguring and sometimes fatal condition caused by exposure to white phosphorus. When the factories closed for the night, many match girls were forced to hawk their wares on the wintry streets, facing a second grueling shift in the freezing dark. Clad in little more than rags and shawls, they shivered on icy street corners, imploring passers-by to buy their matches. Newspapers of the day told pitiful stories of match girls found frozen to death, their unsold wares scattered around them on the snow. For slightly better-off working-class Londoners, winter brought its own hardships. The cost of coal to heat homes soared during cold snaps, forcing many to choose between warmth and other necessities. Some enterprising souls bought coal dust and trash from the dustman to burn, a cheaper but dirtier fuel that added to the city's oppressive smog. Pawn shops did a brisk trade in the winter months as desperate Londoners hawked their possessions to buy coal and food. But even in the bleakest of times, glimmers of warmth and solidarity could be found. Charitable Victorians distributed hot meals, blankets, and coal tickets to the needy. Churches and public buildings opened their doors to provide temporary shelter on the coldest nights. And in some working-class neighborhoods, a festive custom known as the Goose Club emerged. Goose Clubs were a kind of savings scheme in which members paid a few pennies a week into a communal fund. At Christmas time, the money was used to buy a goose for each member's family, ensuring a hearty holiday meal even in lean times. The clubs often met in local pubs, which provided a much-needed refuge from the cold. On the appointed day, a merry procession of carts and baskets would ferry the prized geese back to the members' homes for a celebratory feast. But for most working poor, the icy months meant a constant struggle to keep hunger and cold at bay. Many turned to the grim refuge of the workhouses, the municipal shelters that were the backbone of the Victorian poor relief system. Though they provided a roof over one's head, the workhouses were barely a step above the streets in terms of comfort. Spartan dormitories were often unheated, with thin blankets and straw-filled sacks for bedding. Meager portions of gruel and bread did little to fuel the long hours of manual labor required of the inmates. And the sexes were strictly segregated, meaning couples and families were separated once they passed through the forbidding gates. For many, the workhouse was a last resort, a place to go only when all other options had been exhausted. Yet, even in these grim surroundings, small comforts could still be found. A hot cup of tea ladled out in the morning, a rare bit of meat in the dinner stew, a shared blanket huddled around with a fellow inmate. And for a lucky few, the warmth of human connection could be found amidst the cold stone walls, whether in the form of a kind word from a sympathetic matron or the camaraderie of shared suffering. As the winter wore on and the workhouses filled to bursting, many Londoners began to question the harsh realities of Victorian poverty. Social reformers like Charles Dickens and Henry Mayhew cast a light on the appalling conditions in which so many of their fellow citizens lived and worked. The match girls' plight in particular captured the public imagination, sparking a movement for better working conditions and pay. Slowly but surely, attitudes began to change. Charitable organizations sprang up to provide food, clothing, and shelter to the destitute. New laws were passed to regulate working hours and conditions in factories and workhouses. And a growing middle class began to see the alleviation of poverty as a moral imperative, not just a matter of public order. But change was slow in coming. And for many Victorians, the icy grip of winter poverty remained a brutal reality. Year after year, the cold descended on the city like a shroud, bringing with it a host of miseries for London's poorest residents. Yet, even in the darkest of times, The spark of human resilience endured, fueled by small acts of kindness and solidarity amidst the frozen streets. As winter slowly loosened its grip and the first signs of spring appeared, Londoners looked to the thaw with a mix of relief and trepidation. For the poor, the arrival of warmer weather meant a respite from the daily battle against the cold. But it also brought new challenges. Seasonal work dried up, food prices rose, and the threat of disease loomed in the warming air. But for a brief moment, as the last of the snow melted away and the first green shoots appeared in the parks, the city seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Children played in the mud, their cheeks ruddy with the promise of spring. Coats and scarves were shed, and faces turned hopefully towards the pale sun. In the grand houses of the West End, winter's end brought a flurry of social activity as the season began. Debutantes donned frothy gowns for their coming-out balls, and gentlemen sported daffodils in their buttonholes as they rode in the park. The ponderous wheels of society began to turn once more, spinning a glittering web of parties, dances, and intrigues. But for the poor, the arrival of spring was a more muted affair. In the slums and rookeries of the East End, the thaw revealed a winter's worth of accumulated filth and debris. Mudlarks and rag-pickers plied their trade in the muck, hoping to eke out a few more pennies before the summer heat set in. Match-girls and costermongers hawked their wares in the streets, their voices rising above the din of the awakening city. Slowly but surely, London shook off the last vestiges of winter's chill. In the parks and public gardens, hardy crocuses and snowdrops gave way to a riot of spring blooms. The great glass palaces of Kew Gardens and the Crystal Palace sparkled in the strengthening sun, their exotic plants a riot of color and scent. And on the Thames, the first pleasure boats of the season chugged merrily down the river, their decks crowded with day-trippers eager for a glimpse of the bustling metropolis. But even as the city thawed and life returned to its streets, the memory of winter's hardships lingered. For London's poor, the icy months had been a time of suffering and deprivation, a brutal reminder of the vast inequalities that divided the city. And for the wealthy and comfortable, the sight of shivering match-girls and huddled paupers was a troubling specter, a ghostly reminder of the human cost of their privileged existence. As the last of the snow melted away and the river mists dispersed, Londoners looked to the future with a mix of hope and uncertainty. The great social and economic forces that had shaped the Victorian era were still at work, churning beneath the surface of the city like the gears of a vast machine. But as the 19th century drew to a close, there was a sense that change was in the air, that the old ways of doing things were giving way to something new and uncharted. For now, though, the rhythms of life resumed their familiar patterns. In the grand houses of Mayfair and Belgravia, the season reached its glittering zenith with the Derby and Royal Ascot. In the tenements and rookeries of the East End, the poor continued their daily struggle for survival, buoyed by small acts of kindness and solidarity. And in the halls of power, the great men of the age plotted and schemed, their ambitions and rivalries shaping the course of an empire. And so the city rolled on, a vast teeming metropolis of smoke and stone, of wealth and squalor, of hope and despair. A city where the extremes of the human condition played out in every street and alleyway, where the boundaries between rich and poor, high and low, were etched in frost and soot. As the Victorian era drew to a close, London stood on the brink of a new century, a new age of promise and peril. But for now, the city basked in the warmth of spring. The icy grip of winter finally loosened. And in the streets and parks, in the grand houses and humble vales, Londoners went about their lives, their faces turned towards the future, their hearts full of hope and fear, of sorrow and joy. As the icy grip of winter slowly loosened and spring's warmth began to return, Londoners cautiously emerged from their frost-bound hibernation. The great snowdrifts that had paralyzed the city for weeks gradually melted away, transforming into rivulets that flowed through the streets and sewers. Icicles dripped from eaves and awnings, their incessant patter, a soothing lullaby heralding the change of seasons. But even as the frozen landscape thawed, the memories of that brutal winter lingered in the minds of all who had endured it. The grand snowball fight in Trafalgar Square, with its towering fortifications and mock battles, would be forever etched in London law. Children would recall with glee the snow armies that had taken over the streets, waging friendly wars with snowballs and sleds. For the bands of icebound barges that had huddled together on the frozen canal, their camaraderie in the face of adversity would not soon be forgotten. The tale of the frostbound Flat-Élau with its impromptu parties and shared rations would be retold in dockside pubs and around hearths for years to come, a testament to the resilience and spirit of the city's working class. Even the wealthy West End would remember the winter of 1894 to 95 with a certain fondness. The lavish frost-themed balls with their ice sculptures and shimmering decor had been a glittering distraction from the biting cold outside. Ladies had swanned about in gowns of silver and white, while gentlemen cut dashing figures on the dance floor in their tailcoats and top hats. For a fleeting moment, the icy world beyond the ballroom doors had been forgotten, lost in a whirl of music and champagne. But as the last of the snow melted away and the great thaw began in earnest, Londoners couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. The perils and privations of winter were finally coming to an end. No more treacherous icy streets to navigate. No more frozen pipes and dwindling coal stores. The great London fog, which had seemed to choke the very life from the city during the dark winter months, began to dissipate, allowing the watery sunlight to filter through at last. In the poorer quarters, where the cold had bitten deepest, there was a palpable sense of reprieve. The destitute match girls and street urchins who had shivered in the frigid alleyways finally felt the sun's warmth on their wan faces. The workhouses and shelters, which had been bursting at the seams, with the desperate and the dispossessed, began to empty out as the weather improved. Slowly but surely, the rhythms of normal life resumed. But even as London shook off the icy shackles of winter, the memories of that brutal season would never quite fade. They would live on in the frostbitten fingers of the elderly, in the tales told around the fireside, in the etchings and illustrations that captured the city in its frozen splendor. The winter of 1894 to 95 would pass into legend, a testament to the endurance and fortitude of the Victorian spirit. And so, as the first green shoots of spring pushed their way through the softening earth, Londoners stepped out into the pale sunshine with a newfound appreciation for the turning of the seasons. They had weathered the worst that winter could throw at them and emerged on the other side. Battered, but unbroken, the great metropolis had proven itself once again. A city that could endure any hardship, any trial, and still come up smiling. As the last of the ice melted away, and the Thames once again flowed freely under its bridges, the people of London looked to the future with renewed hope. Spring had come at last, and with it, the promise of brighter days ahead. The brutal winter of 1894 to 95 would forever be a part of the city's story. But it was a story of resilience, of fortitude, of the indomitable spirit that had made London the greatest city on earth. And so as the seasons turned and the years passed, the memory of that brutal winter would fade into history, a distant echo of a time when the city had been held in the icy grip of a relentless foe. But for those who had lived through it, who had endured the freezing nights and the howling blizzards, the winter of 1894 to 95 would always be a part of them, a badge of honor, a testament to their own strength and resilience in the face of adversity. As we look back on that long-ago season from the warmth and comfort of our modern world, it is hard not to feel a sense of awe and admiration for the men and women who came before us. They were a hardy breed, those Victorians, with a grit and determination that seems almost superhuman to our softer sensibilities. They endured hardships that would break most of us today, and they did it with a stoicism and a grace that belied the brutal realities of their lives. So let us remember them, those frost-bound Londoners of old, as we drift off to sleep in our cozy beds. Let us honor their memory and their fortitude. And let us be grateful for the warm homes and the easy comforts that we so often take for granted. For in the end, their story is our story too. A reminder of the strength and resilience that lies within us all, waiting to be called upon in times of trial and hardship. And so, as the last embers of the fire flicker and fade, and the velvet darkness of the night wraps us in its gentle embrace, let us bid good night to Victorian London and its long-ago winter. Let us close our eyes and let the distant echoes of that vanished world lull us into a deep and dreamless sleep, secure in the knowledge that we too have the strength to endure, to persevere, and to prevail, no matter what the future may hold. Good night, dear listeners, and sweet dreams. May the warmth of your bed and the peace of your slumber be a balm to your weary souls. And may the memory of those long-ago Londoners be a comfort and an inspiration to you always. For in the end, we are all of us winter's children, forged in the crucible of adversity and tempered by the icy winds of time. And though the snow may fall and the fog may descend, we will always find a way to carry on, to hold fast to hope, and to emerge at last into the bright and shining dawn of a new day. As the weak winter sun sank below the smokestacks and spires, the icy grip of night tightened upon Victorian London. Gas lamps sputtered to life, casting pale halos in the gloom as a crust of frost crept across cobblestones and window panes. Bobbies on the beat burrowed deep into their capes and mufflers, their breath pluming in the frigid air. From the Horace-dusted gardens of Mayfair to the snow-crusted slums of Whitechapel, the great metropolis battened down against the bitter cold. But this was no ordinary chill. For as the 19th century wore on, Londoners shivered under the deepening freeze of the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long cooling that brought some of the harshest winters in memory. The Thames froze hard as iron, allowing enterprising merchants to set up shops and pubs right on the ice. Blizzards buried the city in snowdrifts taller than a man. And an eerie phenomenon, known as the London fog, swathed all in a yellow-green miasma of freezing mist and coal smoke. Even in milder years, winter was a season of hazards and hardships, especially for the poor. Ragged street urchins risked frostbite and chilblains, hawking matches and chestnuts. Laborers toiled in the bone-chilling damp of the docks and the dust-choked cold of the brickyards. And in the wretched squalor of the East End slums, entire families huddled in windowless rooms, earning scraps in furniture for a pitiful wisp of warmth. But for those with means, winter also brought its peculiar pleasures. The well-to do promenaded in furs and velvets on the frozen Serpentine, leaving servants to build crackling bonfires on the bank. At the Crystal Palace, skaters in bright woolens twirled to the music of an orchestra on a rink made from 3 acres of artificial ice. And at frost fairs on the frozen Tongue, Londoners gawked at jugglers and dancing bears, then stopped for a warming tot of gin served in a glass made of pure ice. Even the fashionable set had its winter novelties from ostrich muffs to man-rimmed pices. In the 1850s, the plucky Lady Frances Harberton scandalized society by wearing bloomers to go ice skating. Her male counterpart, the famed dandy, known as B.O. Brummel, was said to take a warm bath each morning, then stand naked before an open window until fully air-dried and chilled before dressing. But such frivolities were little comfort during the worst winters, like the brutal cold snap of 1814. That February, heavy snows and record-low temperatures clamped down on the city, freezing the Tongue solid for 2 months. Londoners gingerly ventured out onto the ice, first on foot, then with donkeys and carts piled high with wares. Entrepreneurial souls soon erected a ramshackle frost fair right in the middle of the river. There were ox roasts and carnival swings, beer tents, and skittle alleys. Printers even set up a press on the ice, hawking souvenir cards imprinted with printed on the River Thames. It was all fun and games until a sudden thaw turned the fair to slush, forcing merchants to scramble for the safety of the riverbank. Such midwinter thaws were often worse than the cold snaps that preceded them, turning roads to rivers of frigid filth. In January of 1867, a warm spell melted a heavy snow, flooding low-lying areas and filling streets with an icy stew of mud, manure, and rubbish. The deluge backed up drains and turned basements into noisome systems, bringing misery and disease. For the poor, the only refuge from such misery were the grim, Victorian workhouses where destitute families traded their freedom for a roof and a bowl of gruel. In the winter of 1844, a journalist described the bone-chilling dormitories of the Andover workhouse, where inmates shivered on bare boards under threadbare sheets with only a single bucket of coal to warm a room of 50 souls. But perhaps the cruelest winter of all was 1890 to 91, a season so bitter it was known as the Siberian winter. The brutal cold seeped into every corner of London life. From the Houses of Parliament, where shivering MPs debated by candlelight, to the Royal Courts of Justice, where inkwells froze solid on the barristers' desks. Even the animals in the zoo suffered mightily. The hippopotamus was found half submerged in a frozen pond, his snout encrusted in icicles. But it was the poor who bore the brunt of the Siberian winter. That January, the Lord Mayor of London launched an emergency fund for the suffering poor, raising thousands of pounds for coal and bread. Crowds of starving Londoners queued up in the freezing pre-dawn for a crust of bread and a steaming mug of cocoa ladled out by shivering volunteers. At Trafalgar Square, a ragged army of homeless men and women huddled for warmth around the base of Nelson's column, burning scavenged bits of wood and coal. When the police tried to move them on, the square erupted into a running battle of flying fists and truncheons, a sting mass of desperation and rage. But even in the Siberian winter, Londoners endured with a certain sardonic wit. Street hawkers peddled snowballs for the million at a penny a pop. A shop in Islington advertised hot ice for skating enthusiasts. And according to the mocking press, the inmates of Cold Bathfields prison begged the warden to rename it Warm Bathfields until the thaw. In a sense, winter was the great equalizer of Victorian London, sparing neither costermonger nor king. When the old Duke of Wellington, the hero of Waterloo, slipped on an icy step and wrenched his ankle, the story was gleefully reported in the scandal sheets. Even the royal family was not immune. In 1871, Queen Victoria herself came down with a nasty case of bronchitis owing to the severe weather. Perhaps no one captured the cruel glamour of a Victorian winter quite like the artist Gustave Doré. In 1872, he published a collection of engravings called London, a Pilgrimage, a haunting visual record of the city in all its squalor and splendor. One of the most famous images shows a group of ragged children huddled for warmth under the Adelphi arches, staring out at the icy tongue with a mixture of hunger and awe. For all its dangers and discomforts, there was something about a Victorian winter that stirred the soul. The writer Thomas de Quincey, who spent his share of nights shivering in the streets, put it best. Surely everyone is aware of the divine pleasures which attend a wintry fireside. Candles at 4 o'clock, warm hearth rugs, tea, a fair tea maker, shutters closed, curtains flowing in ample draperies to the floor, whilst the wind and rain are raging audibly without. But as the 19th century drew to a close, the winters that had so defined Victorian London began to lose their sting. The Little Ice Age was slowly giving way to a warming trend, and advances in heating and transportation made the cold months more bearable. By the time Queen Victoria died in 1901, the great frosts and icy spectacles of her reign were already fading into memory. Yet even today, when a chill wind blows off the tongue and the gas lamps flicker to life, it's not hard to imagine the ghosts of those long-ago winters. You can almost hear the clatter of hooves on frozen cobblestones, the cries of skaters on the Serpentine, the scratch of pen on ice at the last great frost fair. For a moment, the romance and misery of a Victorian winter live again, a reminder of a time when the very seasons were both friend and foe. a force to be reckoned with and endured. And then, like a dream, the vision fades, and we are left with only the distant echo of a winter's tale. As the icy grip of winter slowly released its hold on London, and the great thaw of 1895 began, Londoners emerged from their homes to survey a city transformed. The once bustling streets were eerily quiet, muffled by the deep snow that had entombed the city for weeks on end. Icicles hung like crystal daggers from the eaves of houses and shops, their dripping a soothing melody as the sun's rays coaxed them to surrender their wintry grasp. For the poor and destitute, the thaw brought much-needed relief from the relentless cold that had seeped into their very bones. No longer would they have to huddle together for warmth in dank and crowded lodging-houses or fight for a coveted spot near the workhouse fire. The ragged match girls could finally feel their fingers again as they struck their wares, their tiny flares of light and warmth, a beacon of hope in the gloom. But even as the city began to shed its frozen mantle, the memories of that brutal winter lingered like a chill in the air. For those who had endured the great frost, it was a season that would never be forgotten. The tales of icebound barges and impromptu snowball fights would be passed down through generations, a testament to the resilience and spirit of the Victorian people in the face of nature's fury. As London slowly returned to life, the icicles melting away and the snow turning to muddy slush beneath the feet of its citizens, it was hard to imagine that just a short time ago the city had been held in the icy grip of one of the worst winters on record. But the memories of that time would linger long after the last snowflake had melted away. For the wealthy and the privileged, the thaw brought a return to the glittering social world that marked the London season. The great houses of Mayfair and Belgravia would once again throw open their doors for lavish balls and soirees, their crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow on the fashionable throng below. But even amid the gaiety and the glamour, there was a palpable sense of relief that the worst of the winter was over. For the great ice magnates like Carlo Gotti, the thaw brought a bittersweet end to a season of booming business. The Norwegian ice that had been so coveted during the freeze would now languish in the holds of ships, slowly melting away as the weather turned warmer. But Gotti was already looking ahead to the next winter, plotting how he could expand his empire and bring the luxuries of ice to even more of London Esselete. As the last of the frost fairs melted away and the Thames returned to its customary flow, Londoners could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The great winter of 1895 had been a time of hardship and suffering, but it had also brought moments of joy and camaraderie in the face of adversity. The ice skating disasters and the tragic tales of those who had succumbed to the cold would not be soon forgotten. But neither would the memories of laughter and togetherness that had sustained the city through its darkest days. And so as the crocuses began to push their way through the softening earth, and the first tentative bird songs heralded the arrival of spring, Londoners could look back on the winter that had been with a mixture of awe and gratitude. They had endured the worst that nature could throw at them, and they had emerged stronger and more united than ever before. The great winter of 1895 would go down in history as a time of unparalleled brutality. But it would also be remembered as a time when the indomitable spirit of the Victorian people shone through the darkest of days. As the last of the snow melted away and the icy fingers of winter loosened their grip on the city, Londoners could finally look forward to the joys and the promises of spring. The great winter had been a test of their mettle, but it had also been a reminder of the strength and the resilience that lay at the very heart of the Victorian character. And as the city began to thaw and the first green shoots of new life emerged from the barren ground, it was clear that no matter how brutal the winter, London would always endure. For generations to come, the stories of the great frost would be told and retold, passed down from parent to child, as a testament to the fortitude and the courage of those who had lived through it. The old would remember the hardships and the privations, while the young would marvel at the tales of icebound rivers and impromptu frosts. But for all who heard the stories, the message was clear, that even in the darkest and coldest of times, the human spirit could never be extinguished. As the last of the winter's chill faded away, and the sun began to warm the streets of London once more, the city could look back on the season that had been with a sense of pride and accomplishment. They had endured the worst that nature could throw at them, and they had emerged victorious. The scars of the great frost would linger, but so too would the memories of the laughter, the camaraderie, and the unwavering spirit that had seen them through. And so, as the great thaw of 1895 gave way to the promise of a new spring, Londoners could finally put the brutal winter behind them and look forward to the joys and the challenges of the seasons to come. The ice had melted, but the memories would endure, a testament to the strength, the resilience, and the unbreakable spirit of the Victorian people. Years later, a gentleman in his doge would pen his memoirs of that winter from the comfort of his warm study, his words painting a vivid picture of a time long past. "It was a season of unparalleled hardship," he wrote, "a time when the very heavens seemed to conspire against us. But it was also a time of great courage and fortitude, a time when the true character of our people shone through the bleakest of circumstances. We endured as we always have, and as we always will, for that is the true strength of the British people, a strength that no winter, no matter how brutal, can ever hope to conquer." And with those words, the story of the great winter of 1895 passed into legend, a tale of hardship and triumph, of suffering and resilience that would endure long after the last of the Victorians had passed into memory. It was a story that would remind generations to come of the indomitable spirit that had built an empire, a spirit that could weather any storm and emerge stronger and more united than ever before. As the old man laid down his pen and gazed out at the blooming gardens beyond his window, he knew that the winter of '95 would never be forgotten. It would live on in the tales told by the fireside, in the faded photographs, and the yellowed news clippings that chronicled a season of unparalleled brutality. But more than that, it would live on in the hearts and the minds of all those who had endured it, a testament to the strength, the courage, and the unwavering spirit of a people who had stared down the worst that nature could throw at them and emerged victorious. And so, as the last of the Victorians passed into history and a new century dawned, the story of the great winter endured, a reminder of a time when the very heart of a nation had been tested and emerged stronger than ever before. It was a story that would be told and retold for generations to come, a tribute to the men and women who had lived and loved and endured through the darkest of days. And though the winter of 1895 had long since passed into memory, its legacy would endure, a shining beacon of hope and resilience in a world that would always be filled with challenges and trials. For the Victorians had shown that no matter how brutal the winter, no matter how deep the snow, or how biting the cold, the human spirit could never be extinguished. They had endured, and in enduring, they had triumphed, a victory that would echo through the ages and inspire generations to come. And so as the world moved on and new challenges arose, the story of the great winter would remain, a testament to the strength, the courage, and the unbreakable spirit of a people who had faced the worst that nature could throw at them and emerged stronger and more united than ever before. As the icy grip of winter slowly released London from its clutches, the great thaw began. Icicles dripped from eaves, snowbanks shrank, and the Thames stirred beneath its frozen surface. Inch by inch, day by day, the city emerged from its hibernation. For months, London had endured a deep freeze, the likes of which few could remember. The winter of 1894 to '95 had been one for the record books. A relentless onslaught of snow, ice, and bone-chilling cold that brought the bustling metropolis to its knees. It had all begun in late November, when the first flakes drifted down from a slate-gray sky. At first, Londoners paid little heed, well accustomed to the chill and damp of the season. They pulled their coats tighter, stoked their coal fires, and went about their business. Little did they know that this was merely a prelude to the great winter that was to come. As December dawned, The snow fell thicker and faster. It piled up in the streets, blanketed rooftops, and turned parks into glistening wonderlands. Children rejoiced at the unexpected holiday, pelting each other with snowballs and careening down hills on makeshift sleds. But for the adults, the snow was a mounting problem. It snarled traffic, collapsed roofs, and made even the simplest errands a miserable slog. The cold only deepened as the solstice approached. Temperatures plummeted to depths rarely seen in the temperate climes of southern England. The mercury shrank into its bulb. Thermometers recorded lows not witnessed in decades. London's great river began to freeze, a rare sight in the age of industry and cinder. At first, only a skim of ice appeared, delicate and lacy, tracing the shore. But as the days marched on and the cold intensified, the freeze thickened and spread. The Thames became a solid sheet from bank to bank, its normal traffic of ferries and barges locked in place. It was as if the very lifeblood of the city had frozen in its veins. Such a deep freeze hadn't been seen since the last of the great frost fires more than 80 years prior. In 1814, during the Little Ice Age that gripped Europe for centuries, Londoners held a festival on the frozen tongue, complete with carnival tents, roasted ox, and even an elephant that trumped across the ice. But those days were long gone, or so people thought. Now, as the river iced over once more, some intrepid souls ventured out, testing the surface. A few skated, others strolled arm in arm, marveling at the strange sensation of walking on water. Enterprising vendors even set up stalls, hawking meat pies, roasted chestnuts, and hot gin. For a moment, it seemed the glory days of the frosts might live again. But this was no pleasure garden. The ice, while thick, was not the smooth expanse of yore. It buckled and cracked, a treacherous landscape riven with fishes. The foolhardy who ventured too far risked plunging into the frigid depths. Even on solid ground, danger lurked. Londoners slipped on slick cobblestones, broke bones on icy stairs, and suffered the nip of frostbite if they lingered outside too long. As brutal as it was for all, the poor suffered most. While the wealthy retreated to the warmth of their drawing rooms, with blazing hearths and heavy rugs, London's underclass shivered in garrets and huddled in doorways. Coal was dear and wood scarce in the city. The destitute resorted to burning rubbish, old shoes, anything to ward off the killing cold. In the East End slums, entire families crowded into a single bed for warmth, fighting for every scrap of threadbare blanket. Ragged children haunted the streets, their bare feet wrapped in scraps of burlap, their pinched faces blue with cold as they begged for coppers or combed icy gutters for bits of cinder to sell. For these poorest of the poor, winter wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a fight for survival. Even those with a roof over their heads and a fire in the grate struggled mightily. The bitter cold found every end gap, sending icy fingers through warped window panes and under ill-fitting doors. Pipes froze, leaving entire buildings without water. Washerwomen's hands cracked and bled as they plunged them into icy tubs. Ink froze in wells. Milk froze in pails. And bread seemed to turn to stone on the sideboard. The cold even shaped fashion. The shivering masses swaddled themselves in layers of wool and flannel, topping it all with heavy greatcoats, furlined cloaks, and stout boots. Ladies donned gloves to hide chill blah-reened hands and buried their faces in thick mufflers. Gentlemen sported beaver hats, woolen mufflers, and high-collared coats. Even the dandies of Piccadilly resigned themselves to sensible attire in the face of the freeze. But it wasn't just the plummeting mercury that made Victorian winters so brutal. It was the fog. London was infamous for its pea-soupers, those dense, greasy fogs that blanketed the city in a yellow miasma. Fed by millions of coal fires, the noxious haze was worst in winter, as households stoked their grates for warmth. On a still day, the smoky fog would settle over the city like a poisonous quilt, obscuring landmarks, muffling sounds, and seeping into lungs. In the dampness and cold, It clung to everything, leaving a film of greasy soot on windows, walls, and skin. Throat-searing and eye-watering, it transformed the city into an eerie shifting labyrinth where even familiar streets seemed alien and treacherous. Worst was the Great Fog of 1879, a choking sulphurous pall that enveloped London for days. It was a fog so thick, so impenetrable, that it brought the city to a virtual standstill. Trains ground to a halt, unable to see signals through the MC. Boat traffic on the Thames ceased for fear of collisions. Hansom cabs crawled through the streets, their drivers holding torches to light the way. The glow swallowed up by the gloom. Crime flourished in the fog-shrouded city. Pickpockets and cut purses plied their trade with impunity, melting into the mist when pursued. There were reports of daring burglaries, of criminals using the fog as a cover to scale walls and force shutters. Even murder seemed to lurk in the vaporous shadows. It's no wonder that a few years later, the menacing London fog would become the perfect cover for Jack the Ripper's grisly crimes in Whitechapel. But despite the cold, the damp, and the dark, life went on. Londoners faced winter with a certain stoicism, a grit and perseverance forged over centuries of harsh climes. They pulled on an extra sweater, huddled a bit closer around the hearth, and carried on with the business of living. There were even some who found joy in the bleakness of winter. Children delighted in the rare treat of a snowball fight or a frosted window pane to trace pictures upon. Sweethearts strolled arm in arm, cheeks pink by the cold, breaths mingling in the frosty air. And on those rare occasions, when the fog lifted and the sun shone, the city sparkled like a diamond under a sheen of ice. For the well-to-do, winter brought its own delights. The fashionable set flocked to the frozen ponds of Hyde Park to show off their skating prowess, gliding and pirouetting in the latest winter fashions. Exclusive balls and soirees featured ice sculptures, frost-themed decorations, and chilled champagne. A new craze for Norwegian ice imported at great expense saw elaborate ice desserts become the talk of high society. One enterprising Italian immigrant, Carlo Gatti, even built an empire on ice. He imported great blocks of the purest frozen water from the Norwegian fjords, storing it in deep cellars insulated with straw. From this chilly treasure trove, he supplied London's elite with ice for their drinks, their sorbets, and their elegant table displays. It was a luxurious taste of winter in the heart of the city. But such pleasures were fleeting, and for most, winter remained a trial to be endured. The icy months seemed to stretch on interminably, each day a battle against the cold, the damp, and the dark. It seeped into bones. It settled into souls. It tested the limits of human fortitude. And yet London endured as it always had. Through the long winters of the Little Ice Age, through the icy grip of the Victorian era, the city and its people persevered. They adapted. They innovated. They found small comforts and simple joys to light the darkest days. And when at last the thaw came, as it always did, it was like a great exhalation. The ice cracked and groaned. The snow melted into rivulets, and the fog slowly dissipated. Londoners emerged blinking into the one spring sunlight, pale and hollow-cheeked, but alive. They had weathered another winter, and the city stirred back to life around them. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest lesson of a Victorian London winter, the indomitable resilience of the human spirit. In the face of bitter cold, biting hunger, and ceaseless dark, Londoners endured. They survived, and when spring came, they picked themselves up, dusted off the soot, and carried on. A little wiser, a little wearier, but unbroken. It's a lesson we could all learn from. We who face our own winters, both literal and metaphorical. The icy grip may seem eternal, the fog impenetrable, the cold unendurable, but spring always comes. The thaw always arrives. And we, like those Londoners of old, will emerge chilled and changed, perhaps, but alive and ready to greet the sun once more. The bitter cold reached deep into the bones of all who ventured out. seeping through threadbare shawls and worn woolen coats, numbing fingers and toes. For London's poor, winter brought a special dread, a season of gnawing hunger, aching joints, and struggling to keep scant coal fires lit against the creeping chill. Imagine the plight of Polly, a young East End match hawking her meager wares on the windy streets. With numb, cracked hands, she holds out the little matchboxes, pleading with the distracted passers-by, her voice nearly lost in the freezing gusts. Like many of the city's poorest, she had little choice but to keep working through the harshest conditions, knowing that an empty stomach and a night on the frozen cobbles awaited her otherwise. For those with nowhere else to turn, the grim specter of the workhouse loomed. These Spartan Victorian institutions offered the barest necessities in exchange for back-breaking labor, but in the depths of winter, even their thin GRL and rough blankets were preferable to the certain death of the streets. The frigid dormitories would swell with the city's destitute, a huddled mass grateful for even these meager comforts against the biting cold. Yet even as the poor shivered, London's wealthy found ways to relish the novelties of deep winter. With the coming of the cold, the city's pleasure gardens and parks transformed into glittering wonderlands, crowded with skaters in bright scarves and mittens. Lavish balls and parties took on a frost-touched theme, with shimmering icicle decorations and powdered snow-white wigs, the height of fashionable seasonality. Most coveted of all were the exotic ices and gelatos of Carlo Gatti, an enterprising Swiss-Italian immigrant who had built a burgeoning refreshment empire. Gatti pioneered the importation of ice from the frozen fjords of Norway, hauled in great shipborne blocks to be stored in deep cellars near the Thames. His newfangled Penlalic ices served in little glass cups became a sensation among trend-hungry Londoners. Gat's ingenuity would launch an international trade in ice. A cold rush that saw increasing tons of hard frozen water hauled across oceans to satisfy the cravings of a sweltering public. Soon carts laden with ice blocks trundling from the docks became a common sight in the warmer months, turning mere frozen water into a booming business. For a few pence, even the lowest Londoner could now enjoy a little taste of midwinter in the midst of summer. But no amount of frozen fancies could fully temper the effects of a true deep freeze. The winter of 1894 brought with it a Siberian blast that plunged London into a glacial torpor for weeks on end. Thick snow muffled the city, accumulating in feet-high drifts that made roads nigh impassable. The Thames flowed sluggishly under a dense layer of ice, its surface an impromptu walkway for daring pedestrians. With cold deliveries halted by the weather, the poor suffered bitterly as their scant fuel ran low. Desperate families burned whatever they could get their hands on, choking the East End with the acrid smoke of furniture and floorboards. Even the workhouses strained under the influx of those seeking escape from the killing cold. Overburdened charities and settlement houses did what they could to alleviate the worst of the season's privations. Shelters opened their doors day and night, offering what warmth and nourishment their scant resources could muster. Kindly societies sprang up to distribute coal, clothing, and the occasional piping hot meal to the most desperate. Slowly but surely, the spring thaw arrived to loose winter's icy grip on the metropolis. Londoners greeted the first green buds and mild breezes with profound relief. Shedding their heavy woolen outer layers and breathing deep the fresh new air, the city emerged from its glacial chrysalis, a bit worse for the wear, but indomitable as ever. Yet for many, winter left an indelible mark, etching its hardships into memory and legend. In the years to come, old-timers would regale younger generations with tales of the deep snows and great freezes of bygone days, their stories taking on an air of survivor's pride. Novels and poems paid tribute to the icy times, rendering in vivid verse the exquisite beauties and piercing deprivations of a city gripped by frost. Even today, a walk through London's Victorian-era districts seems to echo with winter's spectral chill. The narrow alleys and fog-wreathed squares still whisper of rag-bundled match girls, Street urchins huddled over guttering coals, and the clinking of skates on frozen park ponds under WN gray skies. For those with an ear for history, the legacy of those unforgiving winters lives on, a testament to the resilience and suffering of the thousands who endured them. So when the cold winds blow and the night grows long, spare a thought for those Londoners of old who came before, to whom winter was a fickle and unforgiving mistress. Wrap yourself snug in your warm modern comforts. But remember, too, the hard-learned lessons of the Victorian freeze, of charity and fellowship, of finding joy in the bitter teeth of adversity. And give quiet thanks that the cruelest of winters, bite, has for most become a thing of bygone days. As the icy grip of winter slowly loosened and spring returned once more to Victorian London, it was a time of both relief and reflection for the city's inhabitants. The great winter of 1894 to 95 had been one of the harshest in living memory. A relentless onslaught of deep snows, bitter winds, and bone-chilling cold that had paralyzed the metropolis for weeks on end. But Londoners, in their indomitable spirit, had not only endured, but found small joys and moments of connection amidst the frozen hardships. The massive snowball fight that had erupted in Trafalgar Square was still spoken of with amusement and awe, a raucous spur-of-the-moment battle royale that had drawn in young and old, rich and poor alike. For a brief, shining moment, the oppressive social barriers of Victorian society had melted away as readily as the snow beneath their feet. And then there were the snow armies, bands of intrepid citizens who had taken it upon themselves to clear the streets and pavements, armed with shovels and buckets of ash. They had worked tirelessly side by side to free the city from winter's white stranglehold. In the process, they had forged a sense of community and purpose that transcended class and station. But perhaps the most heartwarming tale to emerge from that great winter was the story of the frost-bound flotilla. A group of barges laden with coal and other vital supplies had found themselves trapped in the frozen canal, unable to complete their journeys. But rather than resigning themselves to isolation and hardship, the bargemen had banded together, lashing their vessels into an impromptu floating village. For weeks they had shared food, fuel, and companionship, huddled around makeshift fires on the ice. They had swapped stories and songs, and even held spirited competitions of skittles played on the frozen canal. When at last the thaw came, and they were able to weigh anchor once more, it was said there were more than a few misty eyes and promises to reunite at journey's end. As the last of the snow and ice receded, and London began to bustle and thrive anew, the memories of that singular winter lingered. For some, it had been a time of unspeakable hardship, of hunger, cold, and loss. The city's poor, as ever, had borne the brunt of winter's cruelty, and many had not survived to see another spring. But for others, amidst the adversity, there had been glimmers of something else, of resilience, fellowship, and the unquenchable human spirit. The temp-as frost fairs of winters past, with their raucous revelry and makeshift markets on the frozen river, were recalled with a certain wistful nostalgia. The old ways were fading, but perhaps something of their magic endured. In the years to come, the great winter would pass into legend, immortalized in penny dreadfuls and music hall songs. Artists would paint vivid scenes of the snowball fight in Trafalgar Square, and poets would pen odes to the bargeman's floating city, and Londoners would tell and retell the stories of that ferocious, unforgettable winter, embellishing the tales a little more with each passing decade. For such is the way of history and memory, the hard edges of truth smoothed and burnished by time, until what remains is a glittering tapestry of myth and meaning. And so it was with the winter tales of Victorian London, a reminder that even in the darkest and coldest of times, there is always light and warmth to be found in the unbreakable bonds of our shared humanity. Winter, with all its brutal beauty and savage deprivations, was at last receding into memory. The great winter had left its mark, But London as ever endured, scarred, but unbroken, forever changed, but eternally itself. In the soft spring sunlight, the city stretched and shook itself like a great beast awakening from hibernation. The clatter of hooves and wheels on cobblestones resumed its familiar rhythm, and the cries of costongers and newsboys once again filled the air. London was coming back to life, shedding the shroud of winter like an old skin. But even as the days grew longer and warmer, and the hardships of the great winter faded into the past, the lessons it had taught were not soon forgotten. For those who had lived through it, that brutal, unforgiving season had been a crucible, a test of endurance, compassion, and the unbreakable human spirit. Some would carry the scars of that winter for the rest of their lives. The lingering ache of frostbitten fingers, the grief of loved ones lost to the cold. But they would also carry the memories of small kindnesses and shared struggles, of laughter and camaraderie in the face of adversity. And in the years to come, as London continued to grow and change, as horse-drawn carriages gave way to motorized vehicles and gas lamps to electric lights, those memories would become all the more precious. They would be passed down from parent to child, from grandparent to grandchild. Tales of a city that had faced the worst of winter's fury and emerged not unscathed, but undefeated. The London winter had been a formidable foe, but also a force that brought out the city's unique character, grit, and resilience. And as the first snowdrops peeked through the softening ground, hinting at spring's long-awaited renewal, Londoners could reflect on the season past with a certain hard-earned pride. They had braved the worst that old man winter could throw at them and emerged, chilled but unbroken. The great icy beast had made its mark, but it had not conquered them. Life in all its messy, exuberant glory would go on, warmed by the hope that spring's eternal, even in the bleakest of winters. As the years passed, the stories of that frigid, foggy winter took on the rosy glow of nostalgia. Old-timers would gather in pubs to swap tales of the frozen Tempsil flotilla or the daring exploits of the Souk Snow Army. Children would beg for penny licks at Guinness, eager to taste the exotic flavors that had once been the talk of London. And on bitter cold nights, the ghost stories would come out. Tales of eerie figures glimpsed through the swirling fog, and skaters who glided on moonlit ice, never to return. But even as the memories faded and the city changed, the lessons of that winter endured. Londoners had learned the importance of coming together in times of trial, of finding small joys amidst great hardship. They had seen the best and worst of human nature laid bare by the unforgiving cold, and they had emerged with a renewed appreciation for the turning of the seasons, the eternal cycle of frost and thaw that shaped their city and their lives. Years later, a gay-haired grandfather would take his youngest granddaughter's hand as they strolled through a wintry Hyde Park. Did I ever tell you? He would begin about the great winter of '94, and as snowflakes dusted the girl's upturned face, he would spin a tale of ice and fog, of danger and wonder, of a London tested by the elements and forged anew. A story to pass down through the generations. A reminder that even the darkest of winters holds the promise of spring. And so the memories lived on long after the last icicle had melted and the final skater had hung up their blades. For in the hearts and minds of Londoners, the great winter would never truly end. A permanent reminder of their city's unbreakable spirit, as timeless and enduring as the Thames itself. The city was swathed in an eerie hush, the only sound the crunching of fresh snow underfoot and the distant clop of a hansom cab. Shopkeepers hurried to shutter their frosted windows, while lamplighters raced to ignite the sputtering gaslights, their fitful glow soon swallowed by the gathering dark. Warmth and cheer beckoned from within the snug pub on the corner, its windows ruddy with firelight. But for many, this winter as night meant a shivering walk home to a dank cellar, or a threadbare garret with little more than a candle end for heat. Such was winter for the poorest in Victorian London. No strangers to hardship, the city's poor were hit hardest when the mercury plummeted. The Thames froze solid, with enterprising locals setting up impromptu football pitches on its glassy surface. In the East End, the dead piled up as paupers succumbed to cold and hunger, their bodies left to freeze in unheated garrets. But even in the depths of that cruel winter, glimmers of humanity shone through. When a fleet of cold barges became icebound on the Regent's Canal, the captains and their families faced a bleak Christmas marooned in the frozen wastes of Camden. But word of their plight spread, and soon Londoners were flocking to the canal's banks, bearing gifts of food, clothing, and coal. For a few short days, the frost-bound Flat-Île became a floating village with music and laughter ringing out across the ice. It was a brief respite from the hardships of that harsh winter, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the warmth of human kindness could still burn bright. As the 19th century drew to a close, the winters that had held London in their icy grip for so long finally began to loosen. The last of the great frost fairs was held in 1814, with revelers dining and dancing on the frozen tongue one final time. By the time Queen Victoria's long reign ended in 1901, the old little ice age that had gripped Europe for centuries was thawing at last. Coal fires still belched their noxious fumes into the London air, but the fogs slowly dissipated. And while the poor still shivered in the East End slums, social reformers were beginning to agitate for change. Their calls for better housing and working conditions, a harbinger of the thaw to come. But even as the icy winters of Victorian London passed into memory, they left an indelible mark on the city and its people. In the icebound lanes of Dickens' novels, in the frosty tableau of holiday cards, in the flickering magic lantern shows that delighted children, the image of a city in the grip of winter endured. For generations of Londoners, the perils and strange pleasures of those snowbound months were woven into the very fabric of the city, a reminder of the resilience and tenacity of a people who had weathered the worst that winter could bring. And as the last of the gas lamps gutted out and the city slowly into spring, that unquenchable spirit burned on, a flame that even the coldest of winters could never extinguish. As the icy claws of winter slowly released their grip on London, the great thaw began. Icicles dripped from eaves, snowbanks shrank, and the frozen earth softened to mud once more. For months, the city had been held in THR by the cruelest of seasons, tested by its relentless cold and shrouded in its impenetrable fogs. But as always, London had endured. The memory of those harsh winter days would linger long after the last snowflake melted. They would be immortalized in the pages of novels like Dickens' A Christmas Carol, where the ghost of Jacob Marley clanked his chains against a backdrop of swirling London snow. They would be captured in the frosty works of artists like James McNeill Whistler, who found strange beauty in the city's icebound austerity, and they would be forever etched in the minds of those who lived through them, a badge of fortitude against the elements. For Queen Victoria herself, the winter of 1894 to 95 had been an especially trying one. The 75-year-old monarch was already in a period of deep mourning, having lost her beloved grandson and heir Prince Albert Victor to influenza just a few years prior. Now she found herself trapped by snow at her Isle of Wight residence of Osper House, unable to return to London for weeks on end. It's said that the Queen took to the Osborne grounds in her pony shades each day, stubbornly defying the drifts and determined to maintain her royal routine. But while the crown shivered in stately seclusion, London's working poor faced a far bleaker reality. In the slums of the East End, entire families huddled together for warmth in dank, unheated rooms, pooling their meager pennies for a scuttle of precious coal. Frostbite and hypothermia were rampant, claiming the lives of those too weak or ill-equipped to withstand the chill. For these unfortunate souls, winter was a merciless foe, its icy fingers reaching into the very marrow of their bones. Yet even in the depths of deprivation, glimmers of humanity could still be found. Newspapers of the day tell of how the Thames riverbank at Rothieri became a temporary haven for the homeless that frigid February. Denied other lodgings, Dozens of ragged men and women tunneled into the snowbanks along the shoreline, carving out cramped but life-saving shelters. For a brief time, this frozen shanty town was a city unto itself, its denizens united by the primal need to survive. Such desperation was all too common in those years when Jack Frost held sway. But there were also rare moments of shared joy and wonder to be snatched from winter's jaws. One such marvel occurred on the Regent's Canal in early 1895. The waterway had frozen solid, creating an impromptu highway for carts, wagons, and adventurous souls on skates. But the greatest spectacle was a caravan of stranded barges locked together by the Mar, ice, and transformed into a floating frost fair. For days, Londoners flocked to this accidental attraction, marveling at the sight of the brightly painted narrowboats marooned mid-canal. The barge families made the most of their predicament, hosting visitors in their cramped cabins and selling hot chestnuts and cocoa to the crowds. It was a brief respite from the season's privations, a flash of merriment in the face of adversity. Such is the strange duality of a London winter, where moments of bone-chilling misery often contrasted with flashes of beauty and fortitude. It's this contrast that still fascinates us today, drawing us back to those bygone times of ice and grit. We imagine ourselves there on some cobblestone street, collars upturned against the chill, watching our breath cloud the air as we hurry through the great gray metropolis. In those moments, the Victorian winter feels almost tangible, a phantom presence that reaches out to us across the ages. Perhaps that's the enduring power of a London snowfall. It's a reminder of our resilience against the elements, our ability to find strength, beauty, and even joy in the bleakest of times. The ice may form, the fog may descend, but the great city perseveres, then as now. It's a legacy that was forged in the crucible of those unforgiving winters, a testament to the unbreakable spirit of the Londoners who came before. So the next time you find yourself shivering against the cold, spare a thought for those Victorian ancestors. Remember how they laughed and loved and endured in the face of winter's wrath. And know that their memory lives on in every frosted window and every icicle, a timeless tribute to the city they built and the season they so bravely weathered. The London winter may be brutal, but the London spirit is unbreakable, an eternal flame that no amount of ice can extinguish. And with that, we draw our frosty tale to a close. The snow may continue to fall, and the wind may continue to howl, but inside we are warmed by the knowledge of those who came before. So let us bid good night to the ghosts of winters past, secure in the promise that spring will come again. And as we drift off to sleep, let us dream of London in all its icy splendor and unvanquished glory. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and stay warm until the morning light returns. As the ice-bound barges of the frost-bound Flad de la slowly melted free with the thaw, Londoners bid farewell to the bitter winter of 1895 and looked forward to spring's renewal. The great winter had tested the city's endurance with its deep snows and frigid temperatures. But as always, London had persevered. For generations, Victorian Londoners had faced the perils and peculiarities of their brutal winters with a mix of grit, creativity, and even a certain kind of joy. They had skated on the Thames during the great frost fairs, fought epic snowball battles in Trafalgar Square, and gone on Arctic expeditions right in their own backyard. They made sport of Jack Frost even as they shivered in his icy grip. But there was no denying the hardships that winter brought, especially for London's poor and vulnerable. The elderly man found frozen to death on a park bench, the shivering match girl in her threadbare shawl, the huddled masses queuing outside the workhouse, desperate for a meal and a warm place to sleep. For them, winter was a season to be endured, not enjoyed. As the 19th century drew to a close, Londoners could look back on an era of winter wonders and winter horrors. The Little Ice Age had made their winters a time of both extraordinary beauty and extraordinary suffering. The last of the great Thames frost fairs was already a distant memory, never to be repeated as the climate slowly warmed. But the legends of those frozen festivities would endure. In the end, perhaps what defined the Victorian winter was the city's resilience in the face of its icy orals. Year after year, London met the worst that winter could throw at it, and carried on, scarred but unbroken. Through the fog and filth and frost-baked mud, the great metropolis sodded on, dreaming of spring. Today, we can only imagine what it was like to wake up to the clatter of horse-drawn snowplows and the cries of all hot, all hot. From the pieman pushing his cart through the frozen streets, we can only try to picture the wonder on a child's face as she takes her first gliding steps on the ice at Regent Park, or the despair of a homeless man huddled against a snowbank, hoping to survive another night. But thanks to the letters, diaries, and newspaper accounts left behind, we can catch glimpses of London's winters long ago in all their bleak beauty and hard-won glory. And as we snuggle down in our warm beds, we can spare a thought for the generations of Londoners who came before us, who endured the unendurable and left their chilly legacy for us to marvel at today. So the next time you button up your overcoat and brave a frigid January day, remember the Londoners who once did the same in the distant, shivery past. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find yourself feeling a touch of kinship with your Victorian ancestors, linked across time by the simple human struggle to make it through to spring. And with that, our icy journey through London's past has come to an end. If you enjoyed this frosty foray into history, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'll be here all winter telling tales to warm your heart, even as the snow falls softly outside your window. Until next time, bundle up, stay cozy, and sweet dreams from all of us here at Boring History. Good night.